After almost 2 chapters of working with Christ being better than the angels, he takes a turn near the end of chapter 2 of Hebrews to move toward the concept that's going to be kind of the lead metaphor for the rest of the book, Christ as high priest. And in chapter 2, verse 17, he describes Jesus as a merciful and faithful high priest. And the first piece of work he goes to sort of unpack that is to work on the concept of faithful. The high priest part is sort of on the edge, though not gone, as he starts into chapter 3. But he's going to work on the faithful element in the first 6 verses of chapter 3. And in the process is going to make the comparison between Jesus and Moses. And so after Jesus is better than the angels, he now is going to have Jesus is better than Moses, sort of a little treatment. Though he backs into it in what seems to me to be a most fascinating way. Okay, let's read verses 1 to 6 again, and we dealt. Dorothy said ad nauseum on verse 1 on every detail and word there. Actually, she didn't say that. She just. I thought she would. She didn't. So let's read the first 6 verses again, okay? And we'll start on verse 2 in our discussion. Therefore, brothers and sisters, holy partners in a heavenly calling, consider that Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. Yet Jesus is worthy of more glory than Moses, just as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant, to testify to the things that would be spoken later. Christ, however, was faithful over God's house as a son, and we are his house, if we hold firm the confidence and the pride that belong to hope. So Jesus was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. I think last week I said something about the fact he starts here not saying, oh, Moses is inferior or Moses is unfaithful. He starts with Jesus and Moses kind of treating them on a plane. And I think we talked about this. I wrote a little bit on the 3rd column over there. It's really impossible to exaggerate how important Moses was in Judaism at the time. It's interesting. There's nowhere in the New Testament that a New Testament author puts Moses down as somehow inferior or not worthy or something. They'll say he was superb. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, he will talk about the Old Covenant and the New Covenant and Moses and all. And Moses is just glorious, and the Old Covenant is glorious, and Jesus is more glorious. So he doesn't put Moses and Judaism down to raise Jesus up. He puts Judaism up, and then he puts Jesus higher, which strikes me. I wish the Christian faith had kept that pattern through all of our history, instead of diverting to what we so typically do as human beings. When we want to elevate ourselves or our point of view, we do it by putting somebody else down that seems to be a rival. And you find this author not doing that, and you find Paul not doing it in 2 Corinthians 3. So you couldn't exaggerate Moses. So I think he would have been in trouble with his audience if he'd said something insulting about Moses to start with. So he says Jesus is faithful to the one who appointed him, which places a significant sort of statement about the relationship of Jesus and the Father, that God had appointed him to some kind of role, and Jesus is faithful to God in the fulfilling of that sort of role. And that is like, in some fashion, similar to the way that Moses was faithful in all God's house. And if you note, And if you don't, it's there. There are quotation marks in the new RSV around was faithful in all God's house. I think it was Anchor Bible Commentary, I don't remember now, had said the author appears right here to be sort of working with three texts in his mind all at once, from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And we'll look at them in English translation of the Hebrew first, and then maybe look at the Septuagint. Numbers 12:7 is the lead text, and you can see the translation there that I just copied straight out of the commentary, Anchor Bible, I think, that I got it from. Here is on the screen now. We'll start with... he said, this is God speaking, "Hear my words. When there are prophets among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. Not so with my servant Moses. He is entrusted with all my house." And that's the translation of the new RSV. You'll look at some other translations and they'll just say, "He is faithful in all my house," or "He is faithful with all my house. When I speak with him, I speak face to face, clearly, not in riddles. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them. The context there in Numbers is Aaron and Miriam, who at this late stage of the Exodus and wilderness wandering sort of experience are challenging Moses' authority. And this is God's defense of his servant. I talk with prophets with visions and dreams and things of that nature. But with Moses, it's face to face, and it's clear, and it's not with riddles, and he has seen my form. He has seen my shape. Probably, we're not sure, probably referring to the passage in Exodus 33 where God puts Moses in the cleft of the rock and passes by, and the nice translations say, "and Moses saw God's back." Others say backside, and then you go on. And in that context, he is described as one faithful in all my house, or entrusted with all my house. And it seems to me, I could be mistaken, but it seems to me that the issue that's sort of at play here is Moses as the vehicle of revelation, the means by which God is going to reveal himself to his people, the means by which he connects. And there are prophets, and it doesn't say so here. There are priests, there are wise people. But Moses met God face to face, spoke with him face to face, and was entrusted with, given responsibility for, became dependable or reliable to God in the care of God's house. Now, well, we'll hold that issue going, okay? Now, in that sense, how is Jesus faithful in some sort of similar manner? If Moses is faithful in the care and the delivery of the revelation of God, making God known to his people, and that's his faithfulness, how is Jesus faithful in a similar fashion? It does say he is, doesn't it?
He was obedient to God's direction coming to the world.
Okay. And what does he do in coming to the world? I think the Gospel of John would be most helpful to us here. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we did what? We beheld his glory, which is actually the word that starts the whole Exodus 33 passage about seeing God's backside. Moses says, "Show me your glory." And that's what God does in that passage. So there's that glory connection between Moses and Jesus. And we beheld his glory as of a son or only son of a father, full of grace and truth. And in that sense, well, even the whole concept of Jesus as Logos is Jesus as revealer, is it not? So in the sense that Moses is entrusted with the revelation of God, making God known to his people, Jesus in the author of Hebrews' mind, in some sort of comparable fashion, was entrusted with and was faithful with revealing the very nature and reality of God by his incarnation. Yeah. The next passage that the commentary sends us to is 1 Chronicles 17:14. But I will confirm him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever. I think. Yeah, confirm ends up being the common translation out of the Septuagint, which says, I will make him faithful, or I will make him trustworthy or entrusted with all my house. This is the Chronicles edition of the promises made to David, more familiarly made to David in 2 Samuel 7, that a descendant of David will sit on the throne in perpetuity. And that particular promise out of the Samuel edition gets picked up more frequently in New Testament writers. I think, it's interwoven even in the Bethlehem quote from Micah 5:2 that you find in Matthew chapter 2, verse 4 and 5, or 5 and 6, I guess it is. And I assume most of you know this. Samuel and Kings have a whole bunch of stuff paralleled in Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They're not identical, but they're kind of like synoptic gospels. They have different wording. And the reason the commentary says it's the Chronicles edition, not the Samuel edition, is this word, I will make him faithful. So that seems to be playing on it. But notice again the word house. In Numbers, my servant Moses is faithful in all his house, or in all God's house. In Chronicles, I will make him faithful in my house. And then a passage out of 1 Samuel 2:35. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind, and I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed one forever. Here you have the word priest back into the mix. And once again, you have the word house. If you look at, just looking at the text here, what seems to be the house that's being talked about here?
We are the temple.
It's we are, and the temple becomes a house, and this is the intersection of the church is the temple of the Holy Spirit. This is the Old Testament background for it. We're God's house. It's Israel. Israel will be his house. I think I quote Ephesians 2:22 somewhere in here, where Paul describes the church as a dwelling place of the Spirit, or a dwelling place in the Spirit, or a dwelling place for God in or by the Spirit. So this concept starts clear in the Old Testament, that the people of God are in some sense a house for God, that God dwells in the midst of his people, God dwells among his people, God dwells in the praises of his people, God has a dwelling place where the Spirit works with God's people, which is a fascinating sort of sense of, most of us wouldn't have guessed that concept that we see in the New Testament is built very profoundly on these Old Testament roots, foundations. Now, let's get back to Hebrews, unless you have further observation or comment.
It's
So-
all our responsibility on us.
That's really going to come out in verse 6. And we are his house if. And there's then the condition of holding firm, holding fast. I clicked on the major Greek lexicon, adhere firmly to. Traditions, convictions, or beliefs. And you see the conviction, belief, tradition here. If we hold firm to the confidence, and this translation has the pride that belong to hope. Yeah. Okay?
How do you relate what you said about the house, in that verse in Song? One thing I've desired of the Lord, that I may dwell in his house all the days of my life.
Yeah. That's a good comment, Elbo.
This one,
I like this one. To take a long way around, if I ever get back to your question, one of the fascinating interpretations of Genesis 1 that's been put forth in recent years is that the descriptions and the language, the rhetoric of Genesis 1 is similar to language in ancient Near Eastern religions, surrounding religions, that describe the building of a temple or a dwelling place, a house, with a throne for the deity of that religion. And this is those of you that are in Community Bible Experience, this is John Walton, who does the commentaries on the videos that we do in Community Bible Experience. He's professor of Old Testament at Wheaton, so this isn't some flaming liberal idea. This is solid evangelical engagement with contemporary culture that the Bible is written to. And so he suggests that Genesis 1, in some sense, is describing the creation of this world as the creation of a house or a temple in which God will dwell and sit on his throne and will be worshipped by, well, us, but also all of his creation. And in that sense, the world is a house for God, a temple. The texts we've worked with, we are a temple. There is a sense that to dwell in the house of the Lord, from the Psalm, is to dwell in the world and in the people of God, among the people of God. Now, in ways that are sometimes helpful and not always, God allowed that house concept to be focused into temple. And if you read in particular the 2 Samuel 7 context of the promise that David will have a perpetual dynasty, what that arises with is David saying to God, I want to build you a house. And God says, no, I'm going to build you a house. And it'll be your son who builds me a house. And that word house flips back and forth in meaning in 2 Samuel 7 between temple and a family of God, the people of God, Israel. And so sometimes in that chapter, the house is Israel, the people of God, and sometimes it's the temple. And you say, those seem to be on two sides of the fence. Could be. And that's the yeah, to long to dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Yeah, to be in the temple. But the temple is never, the temple is the symbol, the putting it down into a focal point of that larger concept of the people of God, Israel being the dwelling place of God, and the creation as a whole being the dwelling place of God. And the Old Testament has this capacity to sort of move back and forth amongst those things. And sometimes we get stuck on one of those spots ourselves. rather than being able to appreciate the breadth of it. Mark?
But even the architecture of the temple shows that. There's the Holy of Holies, the holy place, and it just opens up and up and up, and then on the outside, there's the court of the Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
So it shows the focal point,
Mm-hmm.
but it's inclusive, and even the architecture embraces the house in Genesis 1.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Carol?
Is it also a picture of a kingdom? I mean, there's an element of kingdom and government there too, right?
In the Davidic section in 2 Samuel, which is paralleled then in 1 Chronicles 17, kingdom is a part of that. And those passages are not messianic when they are written, they are Davidic. But when the Davidic line disappears at the Babylonian exile, what do you do with those promises? And that's where messianic hope and expectation begin to arise. How can those promises made to David be fulfilled now that those Davidic descendants have been cut off and there's no longer a king who's a descendant of David on the throne? And so the dream or the hope, the vision of Messiah begins to be articulated as fulfillment of those passages, though the passages started with just David and his tribe, his family. Nancy?
I'm thinking about the meanings, the deep meanings of those words. And house and temple both would be protection,
Mm-hmm.
that would include everybody. It would be identification with.
Yeah.
So it's almost a picture of the people connected with God are unique compared to the people who aren't inside the house. I mean, there's an inside and an outside kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Which, back to Mark's comment about the architecture,
Right.
it's often called increasing zones or decreasing zones of holiness. The central, most holy place, and that's the name of it, the Holy of Holies, in Greek is the most holy place. And then there's the second most holy place, and then there's the third most. And it's zones of holiness, which you see also, incidentally, on the Mount Sinai, the top of the mountain, face to face with God, is the most holy place. And then there's a level of holiness below, and then the people are the next level out, and then outside is the earth. So that sense of a focal point seems to be important.
Also, I think probably a little bit of this is the main protection is the house, but because of the courtyard, the Gentile, that means that there's an invitation
Mm-hmm.
to have a connection, if not actually being inside the house. So
Mhm.
that's a kind of a flexible connection that the inside of the house doesn't provide.
True. And the passage that I may end up preaching this afternoon on in Hebrews 10, since we have a great high priest, let us draw near with full confidence, assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed clean from pollution or something of that nature. And the context there is that the author of Hebrews seems to think, hey, the way into the Holy of Holies is now open to all of us through Jesus. That he has become the new veil, and he is rent on the cross. And so there is access. The key word there in Hebrews is the sense of access. And so the invitation is already built into the structure, the architecture of the house. And almost as if it's anticipating a time when the dividing walls won't be dividing, but they come with opening, you can walk through them. And they just had signs that Gentiles couldn't walk past this point, that those signs will come down in Jesus.
Do you think the Gentiles in the room would have gotten that picture? The Jews probably would have,
What room?
well, wherever he was.
This book, Hebrews?
Yeah, I mean, he was telling people face to face about this at some point, right?
I think so. Yeah.
So there were some people there that would not have been Jews.
Yeah, the question is whether the Gentiles would have known what an astounding thing this was, that we think the Jewish folks would have understood very, very well, that access wasn't available to them until Christ. Yeah. Well, we got verse 2 covered, I hope. There's nothing in verse 3. Verse 3 is where he starts the shifting, right? We'll start there on next week, okay?